Hi everyone, I'm Sofia Garcia. I'm the co-founder and the curator for Artix Code. Sebastian is also the co-founder for Artix Code. And then we have the amazing Dmitri Cherniak, artist working on the show that we're about to talk about, Ringers. We've been working together probably since 2019. I started off as a collector of his, and then we slowly started working together and selling his work, and it's been a great, I think, collaboration ever since.
Thanks for kind of chatting about it with me. Ringers, I would say, is the culmination of a few years of my work with an algorithm. I've always been kind of fascinated with the idea of taking a string and wrapping it around a set of pegs and kind of thinking about all the different outputs you can get. From a physical standpoint, it's something that feels so natural to humans to just take a string, wrap it around, and it feels very easy to be able to do this. But from a generative art perspective, it's actually quite complicated. I'd be happy to kind of show you kind of like a brief evolution of some of those pieces. To me, this is kind of like the first time I think I really got something going with this algorithm. It's very simple. You'll see there's different peg colors. Some are used, some are not. I think this is kind of like the first time where I really had something that I felt like, although very basic, like this is something quite interesting. This one here is similar concept. Believe it or not, this is the outcome of a bug that I discovered and I kind of learned to tame. Essentially, what happens is that instead of focusing on the centroid to decide kind of the ordering of the pegs, I have an arbitrary point. And this arbitrary point happened to just create this kind of really interesting look. And it's one of those things about generative art where, you know, the bugs in your code are sometimes the most interesting and best part.
Definitely.
And so that's what I love about this piece. Honestly, it's one of the pieces of mine that I have the strongest affinity for. So this one here, it uses the same kind of algorithm, except what we've done is we've used circle packing to place the pegs into spaces where there are no other circles. And we've also done what I call multi ringers, where instead of wrapping one string, you wrap many. This is, I know this is one of Sebastian's favorites, but what we've done, for example, to differentiate this one from the past one, is that we've created tangents all along the path that circles around them. And you really see those shine on the corners as opposed to kind of the straight lines. So on the straight lines, you kind of have these thick black fills, but on the corners where there's more space, because the tangents are evenly spread out, you really can see it's almost like these like eyelashes. This one also a personal favorite of mine. It's using a grid formation. However, it's not using any kind of special ordering to make it feel like a natural weave, but the multiple ringers and the kind of targets, you know, in these pegs really make it fascinating. Another example here, again, using tangents around the outside, kind of filling in this almost rainbowish type look. This again is like a personal favorite.
I love that.
This one's incredible.
This one is the uses a color palette that I often use. One of the interesting things about generative art is you can use color palettes that are statistically, you know, relevant. So certain colors appear more often in this color palette, and it's kind of tuned to a way that you know, looks really great. Just another example, you know, instead of using a regular grid, I've used a recursive grid, added some spacing, you know, colors on the pegs, and then just show a couple more. I've also, you know, worked with this in 3D. So I ported it to a 3D algorithm. You can see here using the offsetting to, as you get away from the initial ringer, get kind of these more and more nebulous shapes. And just one more, just for fun, just to show you the diversity of kind of the outputs that I've gotten with this, also in 3D. But, you know, this one is almost more like a fun circus atmosphere, to be honest. But using three-dimensional objects, using gradients with shaders. So, this algorithm, again, this is, over a series of years that I've worked with, and I've produced, a whole bunch of work with it. Uh, what I'm really excited about with Ringers is that instead of me necessarily having to curate, every single output, it's possible to own, kind of a piece of this algorithm, like a seed, and there's no artist input whatsoever. So personally, for me, that's something I think is really important for generative art. It's something that I've always wanted in how I sold generative art. People often talk about the idea of like selling an algorithm or owning like an algorithm which creates outputs. But I think it's so interesting that everyone can have a piece of it and see the collective output in one single spot. It really ties into kind of my whole view on generative art, which is just all about automation, automating the process, automating the aesthetic. At the end of the day, someone seeing something beautiful and then realizing, oh, this was created in a fraction of a second. And I didn't have, my input was essentially like pressing this button to generate it. And the artist didn't actually say exactly what should happen. They just kind of gave it a set of rules, and this is the output. And sometimes it's, absolutely amazing. Sometimes it may not be great, but that's kind of, my job is to try to make it so that whenever it does happen, the output is at least somewhat, it makes you think about something. My background is in engineering, and I think that a lot of people outside of the technology space don't appreciate the creativity that goes into the process of automation, whether it's something really simple like parsing a file or doing like, sometimes it can be easy, but sometimes there's so much work that goes into it that just isn't really, it's not able to be appreciated by the general public. And they think like, oh, that job's so boring. Oh, I would never do that. But I think it's a lot of it is really a creative act. And so for me, I want to be able to show that through code and through art. It's kind of what makes me keep going, I think. I'm just going to share the
Yeah.
Perfect.
I also want to ask, because I looked briefly into art blocks, but I would love to get your opinion on, why you decided to do this show with on art blocks and what power that gave for the show itself.
Art blocks, really fascinating. Believe it or not, he just reached out to me on Twitter. And I looked into it. I think there was only like 2 projects at the time. But I saw a lot of potential. Conceptually, I've always thought about ways that I could do something like this. One more thing I will say is that with art blocks, it's been really interesting. The team who's running it, I think, has a really good vision. They're not trying to be like a crazy like sales shop. I think they care about generative art a lot. I think that they care about the community of generative art. One of the things they've built in is, you can send donations directly from their smart contract. So I know that funded, they sent a big chunk to the processing foundation. I figured I would just go through kind of some of the outputs that we saw in the test net. So again, how Art Blocks works is there's a smart contract, and you send an amount of Ethereum to this contract, which generates the transaction hash. And then that transaction hash serves as kind of a seed for how the actual output looks. And so what I've tried to do is I've tried to take, I showed you some of those earlier pieces. I've tried to take some of those, incorporate some of the characteristics, and put this into this project. Obviously, like you don't get to decide what comes out of it, but we can just go over some of them. You can kind of see some of the features. But this right here is kind of the invite that I sent out onto social media. This here was generated on the Art Blocks testnet. So this is a piece, without the little text this is a piece that you could expect to potentially get from the smart contract. So let's go through a couple more.
Wow.
Again, you know, it's compared to that, it looks so different. But you know what you have is a 3x3 grid. You have a number of pegs. Some of them are being used, some of them are not, and you kind of have this bullseye effect depending on the peg. Another one here with the bullseye effect, exact same algorithm. You can see that it's kind of what I call a 4-3 tiling. So it's not a grid per se, but you can see there's offset 4-3, 4-3 pegs. It's wrapped around. It has a fill. And you also have this bullseye effect. I wonder if I picked a lot of those because I like them. This is an example using a 5x4 tiling. And you can see here that the way that the string is being wrapped is what I call looping. So there's a couple ways that you know, you can wrap it around. One is essentially once you get to each peg, you loop around it. The other way is what I call weaving. And so this one here is an example of the weave where you're kind of weaving in and out around the pegs. So this one here, you know, the base is a simple 5x5 grid. We're not showing all the pegs, so the ones that aren't being used are not being shown. Here's a little fun one. These ones, you'll get these every now and then when the actual string is filled in. And this one, it almost just looks like a cartoon character to me. I really love this look. And what's going on here is you're actually using a recursive grid to place the pegs. You're sampling a certain percentage of the pegs, and then you're just wrapping it around. Another like kind of simple one, this is you know, a classic as someone who's looked at many outputs. You know, this is a 4x4 grid. We're using some of them. We're not showing all of the pegs. And the pegs are fairly large. Here's another one. You can see, again, using this looping. So we're not weaving in and out, we're looping around. But this one, you know, you have a different background color, you have a different fill. The black and the white, I think, works really nicely with it. Again, pretty simple. This reminds me of, you know, someone playing tennis almost. So you can see kind of like these human figures. I think that one of the coolest parts with this algorithm is you can look into it all you want. Ultimately, it's a string being wrapped around a peg, but you can't help yourself sometimes.
I was gonna say it's kind of like a you know, this idea in like therapy where they're like, what do you see? Because like in that one, for some reason, I see it like kind of, it looked like a middle finger to me. So it's funny that you're like, oh, I see this nice, you know, tennis game, and I'm like, I see a middle finger.
It's totally. Here's another one. This was actually one of the pieces that the ArtBlocks founder generated on the testnet when I was showing him the project.
This one's really interesting.
It's, again, this is the background is this kind of recursive grid, but you get just a lot of really small ones. So one of the cool things is that you know, for some of these you'll have very few pegs that actually get wrapped around. You could have as little as 2. But you could have one that I guess could have, you know, 81 essentially potentially pegs. So some of them will have lots of wrapping, some of them will have very few. It's this interesting case where, you know, some will be very minimal, right? And some will look like this. So this one,
it's so wild to see the different, like, just all of these examples here, and they're all from like they all have the same backbone, you know. And
yeah, it's the same
variations,
same algorithm, some different components, but ultimately you're just wrapping a string around a set of pegs. And so this one here, pretty wild. it almost reminds me of like a cactus in the desert. It reminds me a bit of Inuit art. I'm from Canada. I grew up in Canada. One of the best things, like Canada, one of the best things about the art is the Inuit art. It's unbelievable. And it's highly available in, any museum. So this to me, I just love this one. That's all I have to say.
Yeah.
Again, very simple. It almost looks like it's like a tuxedo or something, but
I imagine someone playing what's the sport with like the
sword.
Yeah.
Dueling.
Yeah.
Too. Fencing.
It's so cool. Yeah. I feel like they're about to be like on guard. Like
this one here, this is using, so again, some of these will have the centroid offset, so the looping won't be centralized. In this one you can see here, the looping is pretty centralized. Not in these ones. In this one, it's like kind of feels balanced. This one here, it's not balanced, it's off center. And so you'll see some of them as well that pop up where it's not kind of like this uniform loop. It's shifted to the side. Again, you see like a little face in here.
Yeah.
Kind of like an animal, different background color. And yeah, I figured this one just like pretty simple but pretty beautiful. So that's just a sampling of some of the outputs you can get. Some will be so different, some will be similar, but it's kind of all depends on chance, I guess.
How many pieces are going to be generated for the show?
Yeah, so the plan was to do 1,000 pieces. So basically, and after that, that's it. There's no more ringers, at least in this form, ever again. Wow. And so the reason why I think that makes sense, there's a couple things. One is that I personally wanted to make some of my art more accessible from a price point. We've kind of reached the situation now where, the prices that I'm selling like one of ones for NFTs are in the 7 to 10 ETH range. And, that's great, but I personally would love to make it more accessible. I've done this with my prints as well, the one of one prints. The pricing is not for everyone, but I've always been able to do kind of these, once a year kind of sales and sold these at a more affordable price. So that's kind of what I would love to be able to do with this. And also what it does is it allows you to kind of showcase the variety from the one algorithm. Like, if we just did 10 of these, I really don't think it would really capture, the whole concept. And like this, it's not like this thing that I've been doing, I just made this like over a week and was like, all right, like let's sell it. And I'll do like another one. I'll do another one in like, a month or something. This is something that I've been working on for this algorithm and this concept for years. And I've kind of tried to compress a bunch of the kind of more interesting features into this output that personally is kind of like how I've always wanted to sell generative art. I think that everyone gets something that's unique, which is part of what I love about generative art. But then also there's enough of them that, hopefully it's not going to sell out, in like 1 minute and people don't have a chance to get one.
I mean, I'm super excited to see the show. I think it's going to be super me. I'm going to have to grab at the very least. And like, I'm
really excited to see how it comes out. I'm really excited to see the diversity of the pieces that come out of it. I hope that people are kind of surprised at what happens. I think that in terms of generative art, this is something that we've talked about a lot. Generative art is great for kind of like straight lines and like really, you can make really like kind of techie grid looking things really with a little bit of work. This one I think is one of those where it has that organic feel. And for me, that's so important in generative art, trying to make something feel kind of almost human. Sebastian, I know you've said this, like these in particular, you're like, oh, this reminds me of like this statue
Mhm.
or this. And so that's kind of with this one in particular, I really feel it does help kind of promote generative art in a way that is not just like, oh, look at this like grid that's really techy and like this could be in like, you know, the future, you
Right.
know, Blade Runner type hang on my wall. Like this is no like, oh wow, I could think about this in kind of like a modern art context. I could, you know, in an abstract sense, in kind of like a minimal sense, and so that's one of the reasons why this one in particular is I really love.
Yeah, I mean, I personally think your art has so much art historical references, even like in some of the iterations you were showing us. I saw Bridget Riley, I saw another Henry Moore. Like, there's so many references. So I think you're definitely achieving that.
Yeah, I think I try to kind of do my research. I try to learn more about it. Sometimes I come up with something naturally, and obviously like someone else has done it. And so even with this, even with the ringers, I'll just bring this up, but I have this book here uh, by Armin Hoffman, and so originally when I did it, I didn't even know about this, but Armin Hoffman, who actually recently just passed away at 100 years old. So one of the really interesting things is he wrote this book in the 60s about kind of like, I guess what you could say is it's not necessarily generative, but it's like, hey, what if we took a methodical approach to design? And so you know, some folks online kind of were telling me like, oh, you should check this out. And so here you can see an example of him. It's not the exact same algorithm as mine, but conceptually you can see it's quite similar. He has these grid of things, and what he's doing is he's showing down here how it kind of works. And so you can see like, oh wow, he had this concept, but from a computer perspective, he couldn't make this algorithm, right? But he was like, imagine if you did this. And so, you know, that was only 60, well, I guess 80 years ago now or whatever. But, you know, now where we're at is that, you know, someone who has the kind of aesthetic taste, someone who has the engineering kind of background and the mathematical capacity to do this algorithm can take that concept and really kind of bring it to light. And so, you know, it's not just, I showed you some of the past ones I did. I'm not doing the exact same thing as him here. But you take that concept and you expand it out to kind of these new realms. You add colors, you add all these things, and you can see kind of the underlying basis for kind of the art and the design that can potentially exist.
So cool. I think the show launches Sunday, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it's January 31st at 12 Central Time, 1 p.m. Eastern. And yeah, I'm really excited for it. This is again how I like to see generative art being created. I think it's really interesting. I think that a lot more generative artists are going to have the chance to play with this, and it's going to help us kind of elevate generative art in kind of an artistic sense, and also just, you know, helping people get paid for their work. You know, not necessarily from large tech companies who, you know, who fund a lot of kind of new art, like technical art, let's say. And so that's one of the things that I'm particularly excited about.
Well, thank
Well,
you.
yeah, thanks so much, Dmitri, for taking the time to chat with us about your new project. We're super excited to see it.
Yeah, of course, and I'm always happy to work with you. I know that you have one of my NFTs available for sale on Super Rare. So if anyone wants to check that out, please do.